kindly mute your microphone. Thank you so much. So good day to everyone. Good afternoon. It's been a rainy day here in Kampala, but all is well now. You are all very welcome to yet another webinar hosted by Curtail, sponsored by Sinbel Advocates, a premium commercial legal firm here in Uganda. So these webinars are really hosted, and the purpose behind them is to provide some insight and enlighten our listeners, those listening on Facebook and those on our webinar, to understand the different issues that we are grappling with in our society, whether it is in Uganda, and now for the issue that we are discussing today, not only in Uganda, but actually affecting the world as far as religious freedoms in the wake of COVID are concerned. Now, with us is a seasoned panel of experts and internationally recognized religious freedom advocates from across the world who are going to enlighten us on this very intriguing topic. For now, I'm going to request our IT person to mute everyone else because there's some background that can come through. So what are we discussing today? We have a number of issues that are affecting religious liberty, and they're plaguing our country, Uganda, and the world around us. And the latest of which is the lockdown regulations that have been imposed on various economies following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was, I believe, declared a public health emergency about the 30th of January 2020 by the World Health Organization. Now, subsequent with the partial lift of the lockdown came specially crafted guidelines for faith-based organizations in different countries across the globe. So the issues we're discussing are not only affecting Uganda, but they're affecting all of us, whichever country you are. And what has been observed is these regulations have proved to be morally reprehensible and discriminatory towards faith institutions. Interestingly, however, there seems to be an invisible script being followed to draft and institutionalize the operation of such guidelines in the various countries, with very little or no regard to the political, economic, social differences unique to each nation. Already this in itself has raised a concern amongst faith leaders and people of faith across the world who seem to concur that indeed there is a global attempt to muzzle the religious community, especially the church, under the guise of COVID-19. So it's against this background that Curtail, in partnership with our co-sponsors, Sinbel Advocates, a commercial law firm based in Uganda, are organizing webinars like this centered around unmasking the hidden agenda behind the COVID-19 response and approach by governments and towards the religious community, and with specific reference to the church, as well as discussing the way forward for the faith community, having effectively diagonized the matter at hand. So what are some of the areas that we are going to try and discuss in today's forum? We're going to be looking at what is the status of religious rights and freedoms in our respective countries, especially in the wake of COVID-19. We also want to look at a synopsis of the COVID-19 response, especially towards the faith community vis-a-vis other sectors, while highlighting the operationalization of the COVID-19 religious manual and any other laws that have been passed to infringe on the freedom of worship. So we are going to be looking at the content of such regulations and what is the ulterior motive behind these regulations. It's important for us to also discuss what efforts have been undertaken to address the disparity in the approach towards the faith community, while highlighting the role of the faith community in such times. So in other words, what is the way forward for the church? Should we sit back? Is there something that we can do? Do we even know what is happening? So overall, the intention of this webinar is to champion a discussion on the real underlying issues affecting the religious community in the wake of the COVID-19 and its attendant regulations, while mapping out a practical way forward for faith-based organizations. So this is your platform. This is your platform for you, our viewers on Facebook, on the webinar, to speak up and not just sit back and let things happen. Speak up and be heard. And like I mentioned earlier at the beginning, today we have a special bouquet of panelists, and they are from across the world. We are looking at Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, UK, the USA. So it's really a wonderful bouquet that we have of specialists. And these include Ms. Andrea Williams, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Christian Concern UK. We have Mark Swain, who will be joining us, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Freedom of Religion South Africa. We have Professor Teddy Idiabeta, who is the founder, International Christian Lawyers Evangelism Network from Nigeria. We have Mrs. Wanja Wafula, who's a legal consultant from Limitless Fellowship Kenya. We also have Mr. Sean Nelson, who's a legal counsel for Global International Religious Freedom, ADF International from the USA. And our very own Ms. Pendo Ann, who's the policy advisor of Curtail Co. Limited, Uganda. Thank you so much to this distinguished panel. And like I mentioned earlier, I am Joyce Katende, who is your host, and I'm the head strategic relations and training at Curtail Co. Limited, who is co-hosting with Sinbel Advocates this wonderful webinar that is going to enlighten us on the, the implications of these church guidelines on our faith community. So like I said, we have a wonderful panel and I don't want to waste a lot of time. So I'm going to go dig in right now and start with our first profile as I give a brief interest. Now our first panelist is Mrs. Wanja Wafula, who's a legal consultant for Limitless Family Association in Kenya. She is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and currently serves as an independent legal advisor for the Limitless Family Association. Before venturing into private practice in the advocacy space, Wanja worked at top-tier law firms in Nairobi, including Kaplan and Stratton Advocates and Walker Cantos Advocates. Wanja holds a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Nairobi and is an affiliate of the Association of Chartered Accountants, ACCA UK, from Strathmore Business School in Nairobi. Wanja's advocacy work reflects her passion for helping the voiceless in our society. She has championed and participated in faith-based evangelism and community service programs in Nairobi's informal settlements, including Kanjemi and Kawangware settlement schemes. I hope I pronounced that right. She's based in Nairobi, Kenya, where she lives with her husband and 3 children. Wanja, you're very welcome. Could you say hello to our audience?
Thank you very much for that introduction. Hello, everybody. As introduced, my name is Wanja Wafula, and I'm honored to be here and to participate in this. Thank you very much.
Wanja, you're very welcome. And right off, I would like to ask you to give us a brief about, what is Limitless Family Association? What do they represent? Who are they? What do they do? What causes do they champion?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Limitless Family Association is a Christian movement actually, that is under Prophet Ronnie Kabwama, and the main goal or aim is to spread or promulgate the true gospel of Jesus Christ, the powerful gospel of Jesus Christ. And we operate under the umbrella of Zoe Fellowship of Uganda, that's headed by Prophet Elvis Mbonye. So that's who we are. We're all about the gospel, the true gospel of Jesus Christ.
Okay, that's interesting because what you're saying is basically you are a Christian organization, but at the same time, you are coming here as a legal practitioner.
Yes.
So you have both the faith background and you are a legal practitioner.
Yes.
So I'll start off with my first question. The Constitution of Kenya, which is the supreme law, provides for the freedom of religion in public and private life, and specifically for the separation of church and state. So in your opinion, what would you say has been the record of religious freedom in Kenya up till now, until the COVID-19 period?
Okay. So I'll start with the Constitution of Kenya. So we have the Bill of Rights, which is Chapter 4 of the Constitution of Kenya. So we have Article 27 that talks about the equality of freedom and freedom from discrimination, where you should not be discriminated against because of your belief, your culture, your religion. We have Article 32 of the Constitution, which talks about freedom of conscience, religion, belief, and opinion, where a person should not be compelled to act contrary to what they believe. And we have Article 36, which talks of the freedom of association, where every person has the right of freedom of association, which includes the right to form an association, and they should not be denied any registration of any association that they'd like to participate in. So Kenya is primarily Christian-based, and most families espouse Christian values, and so that's how many children have grown up. We'd say in the last couple of years, actually 2014 specifically, we had an incident of one of the pastors who was allegedly misleading his public and stage managing some of the events in his church. So what happened is the Attorney General passed a moratorium based on this and complaints that had been received from members of the public. So the Attorney General banned temporarily the registration of churches since that time. That was 2014. So since then, it has actually not been possible to register a church in Kenya. So we have seen Christians, their rights have been infringed in that you cannot register a church now. So if you want to operate as a church, you'd have to do it as a society or under license from one of the already registered churches. So this has also brought about issues of monopolies, because now we have the big churches that were there before that are issuing licenses of the smaller churches, and then they dictate what they will preach, what they will say, how they will conduct their services. So it has brought several issues because of the ban. And that is also unconstitutional because, like, as I had mentioned, Article 36 of the Bill of Rights of the Constitution says that registration should not be withheld or withdrawn unreasonably. So that's a blatant violation of the Constitution.
Thank you, Angie. Now, if I'm getting this clearly, you're saying that, prior, maybe like a year or two ago, yes, the Constitution still, and is still the current law, it does provide freedom of worship, separation of church and state, but because of certain events that occurred, the state put out some kind of regulations that have started limiting and are now dictating, what kind of churches can be registered. So what I want to know from you, has this escalated because of, has there been any increase in this because of the COVID pandemic, or, it's still at that same level?
About the registration of churches, sorry?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, from the COVID,
has COVID affected any of this? Because what I'm hearing from you is, yes, you have a supreme law that says there should be separation of church and state, but however, you've had regulations that have come out that are now regulating how these institutions should be run. So and this happened even before the COVID pandemic. And I want to know, has the COVID escalated this, or it's still at the same, nothing has changed?
Yes, COVID has escalated this because since we reported our first case in March of this year, 2020, and since then there was the Interfaith Council that was promulgated to come up with regulations that will basically dictate how churches will operate. And actually, there were no church services being conducted during the initial phase of the rolling out of these regulations. So we have now the Interfaith Council. So would you like me to go through the guidelines?
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, I want you to enlighten us a bit, just briefly, on the contents of these guidelines. I want to know your take on them and how they have impacted the faith community, especially the church.
Okay. So they came up with 13 guidelines, which would include providing water and hand basins and detergents and sanitizers, the congregants to wear masks at all time. We have the 1.5 meter social distancing during the services. And initially, you'd only have 100 people allowed to participate in any service or fellowship. Would have no children allowed, and there would be no Sunday school. Would also have no physical contact. That would mean there would be no Holy Communion, no laying on of hands. Would also have the thermal guns that would be used at points of entry. And the duration of worship was limited in the initial stage to only 1 hour every Sunday. So those are the main guidelines that were issued, and they were very unfair at the time because we would see markets full of people, thousands of people, they're not wearing their masks, but the churches were still not allowed to open and function. And even now, they've allowed them to open under the second phase of the rolling out of these guidelines. And we're still seeing, even 2 weeks ago, we have seen politicians having rallies with thousands of people, and the politicians themselves are also not wearing the masks, they're not social distancing. So we can see the discrimination of the Christian community because we have only a few people going to church, but we have the rest of the public running everything as normal.
Which leads us to the question of, do you suspect that there's probably an ulterior motive to all this? Because if church is being regulated, but you're saying the marketplace in Kenya, people can do whatever they want, politicians are doing whatever they want. What are your thoughts on that? And the fact that the church has guidelines, but the other areas don't seem to have any guidelines.
Okay. First of all, yes, I would say there is an ulterior motive because when these laws were being implemented, the government consulted the bodies. There was a 16-member panel that was set up, and 11 members were actually Christians. We had 3 Muslims and 2 Hindus. And yet the laws that they put in place were clearly not favoring the Christians. So it begs the question, who are they actually favoring? And these same councils, that's the National Council of Churches of Kenya, 11 members, and the Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims, that's 3 members, and Hindu Council of Kenya, 2 members. They were the same people who were consulted when they came up with the moratorium to ban the registration of churches. So if we have many Christian representatives in these bodies, and they're coming up with regulations that don't favor representatives, then we really need to, ask what is going on there and take action. My take on this is that, yeah.
That's an interesting point, and I'll come back to you. Right now, I'm going to engage Professor Teddy from Nigeria. But it's an interesting observation that you have made, that an interreligious faith community came up with these guidelines, but the guidelines that were brought up don't seem to favor any of the members of this executive that apparently set up these guidelines. So it begs the question, was this just a rubber stamp meeting, or did they actually participate in this? But I want you to think about that. In that, right now, I'd like to invite Professor Teddy Idiabeta, who is the founder of International Christian Lawyers Evangelism Network, Nigeria. I'm hoping our IT person can put up his profile as I share a bit about his extensive work. Professor Teddy Idiabeta Esquire is the founder of Abrelis Research, which is an advanced business school of research and legal innovation studies online. And he is a barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of Nigeria. He is the principal consultant at Prof. Teddy Law Consult, a Nigerian law firm registered as a dispute resolution, practitioner research, and general legal service law firm. He is a transnational legal research and dispute resolution consultant. He has facilitated advanced academic and practitioner research for over 2 decades. That's like 20 years. He's also a capacity building consultant and international legal learning facilitator. Interestingly, as an undergraduate at the University of Benin, Edo State in Nigeria, he was honored as the most prolific writer in the faculty, while he was just a 200 level student, for demonstrating excellent skills in writing and publishing in the faculty, which made him win the admiration of his peers, seniors, and junior colleagues. He also founded a research group, the Young Legal Research Communication Corps, as a law student in his university, and has written over 20 and wrote over 20 unpublished academic and non articles as a student, and over 40 unpublished works bordering on interdisciplinary subjects. He is the inventor of MED, psycho-legal analytical trial and lawyering evangelism. That's a mouthful. MED, psycho-legal analytical trial and lawyering evangelism. His two research innovations that were first tested in resolving a transnational legal dispute in Dubai. There was one in Dubai in 2017 and one in 2018. He's Africa's first practitioner research professor on legal oath. Professor Teddy Idiabeta Esquire is a very popular social media influencer who gives talks and posts comments on both national and international issues affecting our society. He's a very patriotic Nigerian with 3 innovations to his credit. He has founded several journals designed to promote online interdisciplinary research within and outside Nigeria. Professor Teddy, you're very welcome. Could you say hello to our listeners? Professor Teddy, can you hear me?
Oh, it's pleasure. Oh, analyst, how are you doing?
Professor,
Can you hear me?
yes,
Hello.
we can. Yes,
Hello.
yes, yes, we can hear you. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Yes, Professor, we can hear you. Hello? Professor Teddy, are you there? Can you hear me? Hello, Professor Teddy? I think Professor Teddy is having a challenge right now. I don't know if you, can you hear me now? Professor Teddy, can you kindly unmute your microphone? So we're having a challenge with Professor Teddy. Yes, I can hear you now. Professor, can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to request our IT person to.
Now?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Now?
Yes, I can hear you. So I'm going to start right off.
Hear me now?
Yes. My first question to you is, I would like you to tell us briefly. Yes, I can hear you. Professor, I would like you to share with us briefly about International Christian Lawyers Evangelism Network. We would want to know who they are and what it does and what causes they champion. Professor, did you? Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you I go on? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
we can.
Can you hear?
We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Can you hear? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hear me? Okay, okay. The National Lawyers Net. Okay, International Christian Lawyers, yeah, yeah. The International Christians Evangelist Network is a network of lawyers that are into evangelism. As a matter of fact, it was actually conceptualized as a faith-based strategy of using law and ministry to the word of God. And
Professor Teddy, I'm going to request
say that there's actually so much. It is much work in order to law as a ministry, the word of God.
Professor Teddy, I'm going to request our IT person
to
assist you because you're not very clear on our end. And while he engages with you, I'm going to quickly cross over to another panelist in the interim. Our IT person is going to try and assist you with your connection.
Okay.
So in the meantime, you'll engage. And in the meantime, I would like to introduce another panelist as we are waiting for Professor's network to get clear. And that is Miss Andrea Williams. So I'm going to request that her profile is put up for all of us. So our next speaker is Andrea Williams, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Christian Concern, United Kingdom. Andrea is a barrister who has practiced at all levels of the British judicial system. After pioneering the student and policy work at the Lawyers Christian Fellowship, she went on to found Christian Concern, the Christian Legal Center, which have run some of the most high-profile Christian freedom cases and campaigns in Europe. She is a leading analyst, campaigner, and spokeswoman on issues of national importance in the moral life of the nation and a defender of Christian liberties in the parliamentary process, the justice system, and the media. Andrea, you're very welcome.
It's great to be with you. I've been with you.
You're very welcome. So straight off, Andrea, I'm going to ask you, can you tell us a bit about Christian Concern? What is it about? Who are they? What do they do? What causes do they champion?
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. Who would have imagined that here in the United Kingdom, we would need an organisation like Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Centre? When I qualified as a barrister in 1988, I could never have imagined that in response to a health crisis, the government would close all churches down and would insist and actually potentially criminalise the church if they were then to open. I would never have imagined that the government would, or that we would be in a situation whereby men and women would lose their jobs simply for saying that marriage is between a man and a woman and not acceding to the redefinition of marriage to two men and two women. I would never have imagined that we would have doctors who would lose their jobs for saying that a biological man could never be a woman. Well, at the Christian Legal Centre, we have 1,000 case inquiries now every year where Christians in the United Kingdom, simply for living and speaking out their faith in Jesus Christ, find themselves in trouble at work or find themselves even in trouble with the criminal law. In these last days, we have had a pastor who has been accused of hate speech by an LGBT activist group. He has had his church threatened with burning down, and yet it is he who has been told to desist from any hateful language. So the other thing that we do at Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Centre is that we lobby into Parliament with regard to the laws that are being passed pertaining to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, laws surrounding life, laws surrounding family, laws surrounding marriage. Very often framed in human rights language and equality diversity language. We then find that our very freedom to speak the gospel clearly is put at stake. And so I very much want to warn other nations, and certainly those in Africa, of what can happen when we don't hold to our Christian foundations. Because I think many people find it extraordinary to imagine that basic freedoms can be lost. And if they can be lost in the United Kingdom, then they can be lost anywhere in the world. So I hope that we act as a warning signal to the world of what it is that can happen. We have some 25 staff at the Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Centre. We are 5 full-time lawyers. We have a full-time media team speaking into public life, and also a policy team researching and speaking into Parliament. We also seek to educate the church, because we really believe that the church has to understand the times. We have to reach the pastors who can inform their congregations. So this is a snapshot into the world of our work.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I love the passion that clearly comes out when you're speaking. And I love the fact that you have a legal background, but you're very passionate about the faith. So for those of us who think that maybe you might be a lawyer and you can't have the faith, you have shown us that, you know what, it's possible for the two to coexist. Now, you've talked about Christian Concern and how it provides legal support to Christians who are unashamed about Jesus and the truth that flows from him, while exposing secularism. You're promoting Christian freedoms to live for Christ and to profess him, as well as the freedom to speak of Jesus Christ and his pattern of life. So my question is to you, from the looks of things, it appears that Christian freedoms and the pattern of Jesus Christ, as you would say, seems to have been relegated by some nations and religious leaders to more, especially over the last couple of months, where the Christian religious freedoms seem to have been treated as a thing of non-essential value. What has been your experience in the UK? How are entities like yours reinforcing the place of God back in society amidst what seems to be a cunning attempt to eliminate him from the lives of people?
Well, I think that very much what has happened around the COVID emergency legislation builds on 2 or 3 decades where our laws have moved very significantly away from their Christian basis in the United Kingdom. And that's framed around human rights legislation and equality and anti-discrimination laws. Now, the way in which those laws are framed sound excellent. And of course, we're passionate about human dignity. But what happens around human rights law is that it's not rooted in any notion of an absolute law, so God-given law. And that's where the Christian framework is very important. And so then what happens is there's a whole range of what it means to be human and how we live out our freedom as human beings in terms of identity. And so you get identity politics and even identity legislation. And when there's no common consensus about how we live and what it means to make a family and what it means to be free, then you get alternative viewpoints contending in the public space as equal and as valid. Yes, you were going to ask a question?
No, I'm still listening to what you're saying, because from what you're saying is you're basically giving us a snapshot of what can happen, and probably, like for example, in the case of Uganda, right now the regulations are being drafted and all that, they've just come out. What you're giving us is a snapshot of the end result of the church keeping quiet, of people like you and I keeping quiet. The end result is what is happening in the UK. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And I think that we have to, and I think because the legislation sounds so kind and so rational, it's very important to understand the end game, to understand what happens. And this is where we at the Christian Legal Centre and at Christian Concern provide your window into the future. So that the very concepts of what it means to be male and female become fluid in law. And if a man can be a woman, and a woman can be a man, and you can, in law, even though they are biologically male and biologically female, for instance, and then you can get punished or lose your job for saying that a man cannot become a woman or a woman cannot become a man. That's the end game. That's the end of where we get to, because how the law views being transgender is equivalent. It's just equivalent to being, or it's actually more protected than being Christian, because Christian just becomes something you think, not something that you really are. And so
if I get really, what you're ultimately saying is allowing the state to put up these kind of regulations. The net effect is the law of God, which we consider supreme, those of us of whatever faith that we have, the law of God that we consider supreme is being relegated and being put under the law of the state.
That's absolutely right.
And so we need to guard against that.
Absolutely. And then
which leads me to the next question.
Yes.
Okay. Which leads me to the next question. So beyond churches being closed, what other aspects of life have been inadvertently affected? And what issues do you find yourself dealing with that have the ultimate connection to religious freedoms? Because this is just a start.
Can I just check that I'm coming through loud and clear?
Now you're clear.
Yes. What we've had in terms of the church closing is we were told by the government that the church is non-essential. And so for the first time in the history of the United Kingdom, the churches were closed down. Well, in fact, it happened only once in 1201 by the demand of the Pope at the time. Churches were closed from, 1208 until 1214 in the United Kingdom. But so that was the only time in the whole of our history we have had serious plagues, serious health pandemics, but never in our history has the church closed. The church has always been viewed as at the heart of public life, as an essential service. We allowed ourselves to be closed because the government views us as not significant to public life. We were in a position whereby supermarkets remained open, chemists remained open, off licenses that said sold alcohol remained open, but the churches were closed. And I think that in a sense is an indictment on the church, that we were in that position at the start of the lockdown. And if we had opened, we would have been liable to criminal sanction. At the Christian Legal Centre, we brought a legal case to say that what the church provides is essential. And what we need to do as the church is work out ways in which we are in the public space and providing the public services, whether it's in education or health or community support. We need to be opening our doors, and within the context of health and safety, as it were, we mustn't be reckless, but we must be open and at the forefront of public life. And so at the Christian Legal Centre and at Christian Concern, we have been vocal and visible in the public space, advising churches to stay open safely where they can and be at the heart of providing daily public services.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful news to hear. You've ended on an interesting point, because you said what happened in England is the churches were closed. However, supermarkets were left open. Places that sell alcohol were left open. And just before you presented, we had Mrs. Wanja from Kenya telling us the churches were closed by the regulations, but the markets were left open, which leads us to start thinking, you know, is this some kind of syndicate? Is there something behind this? Why are the regulations all so similar and pointing to closing churches, but at the same time leaving everything open? Because if the ultimate objective is COVID, isn't COVID prevalent in all these other places? So, and I'm glad to hear that you said Christian Concern has petitioned court for the churches to be open. And later on in today's discussion, I would like to hear more about that case and what is happening, what is the outcome, how far are you with that? But I'll give you an opportunity to think about that. But in the interim, I would like to invite South Africa. And this is Michael Swain. I hope I'm pronouncing it well. If not, I apologize profusely. And I'm going to request our IT person to put up his profile. So Michael Swain is the Executive Director of Freedom of Religion, South Africa. He is a Christian minister with a legal background, having graduated with a degree of law from the University of Bristol in London, where he was raised. He is currently the Executive Director of Freedom of Religion, South Africa, for SAF, an organization that exists to protect and promote, both in court and the legislature, basic constitutional rights of freedom of religion and conscience for future generations, and to inform, lobby, and mobilize religious and political leaders and the general public to ensure that these rights are affirmed. He also has vast experience in marketing and communications, having served as the Chief Communications Officer for Lewis Group International, a family-owned company with a strong Christian ethos, as well as having co-founded Dreamsmiths Marketing, which today is the leading South African conference and events management company. Michael is passionate about seeing the purpose of God fulfilled in and through him and his church in Cape Town, South Africa, and the rest of the world. His involvement in ministry exponentially intensified in 1995 when he was appointed as the Director of Administration, responsible for creating the legal and operational infrastructure for the movement, and later graduated to the Executive Vice President of his people churches and Bible schools in 11 nations and represented them nationally and internationally. Together with his wife, they founded Trinity Software, which produced the first computer digital study Bible. Please join me welcoming Michael Swain, the Executive Director of Freedom of Religion, South Africa. Michael, you're very welcome. Can you say hello to our audience?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me, representing Freedom of Religion South Africa, known as 4SA, to this webinar. Really appreciate being with you, and thank you as well for all the other participants. Andrea particularly is a legend in our world, by the way. She was very much instrumental in helping us to set up freedom of religion in South Africa. And yeah, we owe her a great debt, as I'm sure to many others.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Right from the start, I'm going to ask you to tell us a bit about 4SA. What is it about? Who are you? What do you do? What causes do you champion?
We are a legal advocacy group, in as much as in South Africa, to give you the context, we have a constitution. And our constitution effectively is the highest law of our land. And so within that constitution, there are specific freedom of religion rights, section 15 in particular, plus other rights, the equality rights. We are a freedom of conscience, religion, belief, thought, opinion. That is all part of the equality right clause as well, along with gender and race and various other sexual orientation. these are equality rights. And of course, then we have a freedom of association, freedom of assembly rights. So we exist to protect and promote our freedom of religion rights within South Africa. And we do so by appearing before government commissions, for example, when they produce reports, which has happened to us, where they wanted to at one stage regulate religion. They probably still do want to regulate religion, and we had to mobilize against that. We appear and often make submissions and actually create pro forma submissions to allow others to engage in democratic processes for various bills which we see coming through Parliament, which may be adverse to freedom of religion rights. And of course, we also intervene in court cases. So sometimes we are a principal party in a court case, and sometimes we come in as a friend of the court, and sometimes we provide legal advice for people who are defending similar actions. So we are a small team. I say that we are 4SA actually at the moment. We are 3SA. There's myself as the executive director, and we also have a very, very gifted and brilliant advocate, the person of an advocate Nadine Badenhorst, and then we also have an attorney, and that is Daniela Ellerbeck. And so an attorney would be the equivalent of a barrister in the UK, and an advocate would be the equivalent of a barrister.
Wow. And in addition to all this, you are a minister. So
Yes.
that leads me to my first question. So 4SA serves as a voice to government, to the parliament, Chapter 9 institutions, courts, and the media on issues which threaten to affect our constitutional rights to religious freedom. How have you actively engaged along these fronts following the closing of churches?
Well, we have built up over time a very good relationships with major church groupings. And so what we did was we effectively, first of all, looked at what the regulations consisted of and the issues and the challenges that we saw. We were literally given, the regulations were published on the Saturday, and closing comments were, in fact, then on the Monday. And having done that, and having, of course, I think, as Andrea said, having recognized very quickly that the religious community, and we, by the way, represent all faiths, so we're not specifically representing Christian faiths, because in South Africa, all faiths are equally protected. But we are primarily actually representing Christian faith, and we are ourselves Christians. But that said, religion was not, and religious workers, religious organizations were not recognized as essential services. And again, this is unprecedented, because typically you find the church particularly at the forefront when there is a pandemic or a plague. It's been that way since ancient times, and yet although others were recognized as essential services, the church was not. And that was initially the biggest thing that we contested.
Okay, thank you so much. So what was the, can you give us an update of what has happened? Are you still in court? Is there any change, or are churches still closed? What is happening right now?
So we lobbied very hard with a consortium. We basically gathered a group of approximately representing 18 million people from the faith community. So we find in South Africa that it is, in that sense, a numbers game. If there are enough people who you represent, government pretty much has to pay attention to you. And we wrote propositions to many different structures of government. Here we have the Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Ministry, and that minister actually is effectively running the country under our state of national disaster, which has been declared. And then there is a nerve center. We have obviously the president himself. There is a command council for Corona, a national Corona command center. And so we were lobbying even the Speaker of Parliament. We were engaging with other individual MPs to bring questions in Parliament. So we lobbied very strongly. And fortunately, not just us, there are other major organizations in South Africa, the South African Council of Churches, which has historically played a major role in the democratic process or the struggle for democracy in South Africa. And we ultimately succeeded, actually back in April, to have the churches recognized as religious and as essential services. And also at that stage, we were allowed to open, subject to very strict conditions, to a maximum of 50 people per church premises. That was initially a good thing, but then it turned out to be problematic because in South Africa, we had what was called a very hard lockdown, and we were pretty much under house arrest for about 5 weeks or so. And when society began to open up, what became apparent was that government were applying a different standard. They weren't applying an equal standard. In South Africa, under our constitution, you can only limit constitutional rights to the extent that they are reasonable, they are equitable, they are obviously justifiable, and that they are the least restrictive means of actually achieving the objective or the reason for limiting them. And so when other sectors of society opened up, they did so because essentially the major threat of the coronavirus, which obviously was unknown at the beginning, had clearly begun to pass. And even the temporary hospitals and the type of emergency restrictions that they had set up were starting to be dismantled. And then other areas of society were allowed to open up significantly. So all the shopping centers were opened up. Taxis were allowed to operate at 100% of capacity. Airplanes began to fly 100% of capacity. We then had trains 70% of capacity. Car parks were full. Restaurants were full. Shebeens, which is our sort of like, local bars. Even casinos were allowed to operate at 50%, and yet the church was, and I have to say still is, limited to a maximum of 50 people. Even driving a church is illegal, although there are drive-in cinemas that are operating where literally, up to 800 or 1,000 people will watch a movie, and yet you cannot have more than 50 people in the church car park listening to a message. So we did see very much an unequal scale, and we have been lobbying very strongly with others to actually have that redressed. And I believe we are actually on the cusp of succeeding in our efforts. Last week, the week before last, we and others were invited to an interfaith meeting with the president, and there was a very strong message given to him. And perhaps there is a sensitivity politically, and often these things play in together, because the government has been, I think, certainly members of the ruling party have been very much complicit in some widespread and quite reprehensible corruption in terms of some of the contracts for personal protection equipment and so on and so forth. And so they're reeling because next year there is an election, and they basically need the support of the religious community, or at least they don't need the active opposition. And so that, I think, has maybe opened a gap for us. But we were able, and Advocate Nadine Badenhorst participated in the meeting last couple of weeks ago now, 10 days ago, where there was pretty much a demand that the religious sector be allowed to reopen. Up to that point, we'd had numbers of meetings, or a few meetings with our constituency, and they had, some of them were obviously very happy with the negotiations, and we've been running a concurrent media campaign as well, but hesitant to litigate. There have been about 140 cases of litigation against government. They've basically resolved, I think, about 90 so far. But the problem with litigation is it just takes too long. So litigation really is only valuable here to the extent that you're sort of rattling your saber. And often those who rattle their sabers have actually got what they wanted from government. So that was an option. We were actually drafting papers when the invitation to speak to the president came. And the other resort is, of course, some form of peaceful civil protest, where, as has happened in the US and certain churches, the churches have just decided that they are going to reopen, and that they will rather listen to God or fear God rather than obey Caesar. So that was all in the mix. But what we hope will happen, because the president then issued a very positive statement, is that possibly even today, even this evening, the president is going to be making an announcement, and the lockdown level will ease down to lockdown level 1, which is the lowest lockdown level. And we are certainly expecting that 50% of floor space will then become the standard rather than a maximum of 50 people. And that will make a huge difference. Effectively, once that happens, the church has been allowed to reopen. So it's been a big struggle. It's been, I think, a struggle which has actually, in a sense, helped to unify the religious sector. And it has certainly been one where I think we have seen the value of getting significant groups of people and making sure that we as 4SA, which is a big breakthrough for us in that sense, actually have a seat at the table recognized by government, because that is something which, again, we believe will also put us in very good stead going forward when we negotiate on the multiple other freedom of religion issues that we face in this country.
Wow, wow. Thank you for sharing all that. That's a lot of information for us to take on. It's interesting. You joined us a little later in this conversation, but it's interesting that when you're sharing the experiences in South Africa, they seem to mirror what happened in Kenya that has been shared with us, what has happened in the UK, the fact that churches were closed, were not considered essential services, and yet you'll find bars open. You mentioned casinos, restaurants. And from what you've shared, you said that in the regulations in South Africa, they said for churches, you can have a maximum of 50 people, but then for the others, you can be at 100% capacity. Restaurants, bars, casinos, you even have drive-in cinemas with over 800 people. And it's for those of us who are listening, sometimes when you hear something like this, you're hearing it in one jurisdiction, then you're hearing it in another jurisdiction, then you're hearing it in another jurisdiction. It starts to make you think that, is there something that we are not seeing? Is there some kind of syndicate? Is there something that is being orchestrated behind the scenes? Actually, that is the real motivation behind this. And it's interesting that you've shared all this with us, not having heard what our previous presenters shared. Now, I want to know, in your opinion, from what you've said litigation takes too long. There have been some civil protests maybe in the US, and now you've actually had to go to the president and meet with him and issue a strong statement, and hopefully this evening you'll get some kind of positive feedback. I want to know, in your opinion, do you feel that the church is at crossroads? It's like in terms of, what if you don't get the kind of response that you're hoping to get, like say this evening or in the next couple of days? Do you feel that the church is on a brink of a revolution, considering that many governments, just like South Africa, seem not to be giving priority treatment to the fundamental and God-given right to freedom of worship?
Yes, I think that in South Africa, we probably have quite an advantaged position, simply because so many of our people are people of the Christian faith. The census consistently shows that close to 80% of the people in this country will put up their hand and declare Christianity to be their faith. So government knows that they can't be too strong-arming when it comes to pushing the church around. And the church has actually been very cooperative under this current corona crisis. They have played a critical role of helping and supporting the efforts of government. They have done everything, as I'm sure has happened in other countries, from looking after people, feeding people, housing people. They have really come to the party in that sense. I think that government at this stage will probably be keenly aware, and I certainly think that I can speak to the sentiment that we picked up in our meeting shortly before the president actually said, yes, he would meet with us and we were able to present. People were starting to get very unhappy, and for in this country, for the church to actually move against government is a massive thing, even for people to talk about that. And even for people to talk about recommending, for example, to their people that they do not vote for the government in the forthcoming elections, which was also something which was being mentioned. That is a pretty serious message for government. So there is no particular reason why we believe we won't get what we ask for. We think that we will. We certainly should. And I think if we don't, then very quickly it's going to ratchet up to the next level. I think we will then certainly bring litigation, because if nothing else, it profiles the issue and it sends out a strong message. And I think that you will probably see some pretty widespread civil disobedience. And we're talking churches and church movements with millions of people potentially just saying, look, we're just going to reopen anyway. Now, obviously, you must, and everybody appreciates that this is a health crisis. This disease is a killer, and hygiene, social distancing, all the protocols are, I think, valid and reasonable within reason. For example, we do have some crazy things like you're not supposed to sing without, only one person's allowed to not wear a mask when they're singing, for example. I mean, there have been some very arbitrary and capricious regulations. But I think in this country at this stage, if government was to come back tonight, or the president says tonight, look, he's considered it, but no, I think very quickly you're going to see it escalating quite sharply.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, we are dealing with a disease that's contagious and all that. Of course, the question to everyone, and which is, I think, the string that has been coming across all through is COVID more contagious in the church? And outside the church, it doesn't seem to be that contagious because the marketplaces don't seem to have the regulations. The supermarkets don't seem to have the same regulations. But somehow, you know, because when you present different standards for the church and then for everything else, it's something else, then it gives the impression that somehow, you know, it's a selective virus, which isn't the case. It's the same people who go to church who go elsewhere, you know, to these different entities. So it's something I think for us to think about.
One of the things we had to contest is, of course, the first reports, which I think could well have been deliberate, coming out of South Korea, which turns out to be pretty baseless, was the fact that churches are super spreaders. You know, we had a situation here in Bloemfontein where there was a conference and people had come in from the States, and people with the COVID-19 infection, and people were infected as a consequence. But again, it was unsubstantiated, it was unproven, it was certainly far less than anybody was being told. But somehow, of course, if you label the church as a super spreader, that then means kind of justify the clampdown. And so we've had to be contesting that, and we've contested it factually, and we've contested it. And also, the other thing we've also contested is the perhaps over-exaggeration that we've had in this country of this disease and its threat. And it's very concerning when, you know, cabinet ministers and our sort of head of our government are comparing at this stage corona or COVID-19 with the Spanish flu. This is nowhere near the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu killed 25 million people in a far, you know, less conjoined world with a far smaller population within the first 6 months. And globally in the first 6 months, I think COVID-19 killed just over 500,000. Now, it's not to say that's not serious, because every death is obviously tragic for people, for the families and so on. But to try and compare it to the Spanish flu, when the data globally is clearly contrary to that from government, was very concerning. And so again, where we found that there have been inaccuracies of reporting, we have obviously had to contest that as well.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing that. I'll still come back to you. I have a couple more questions for you, but we have another panelist on, and I would like our IT person to share the profile of Ms. Ann Tendo with us. Now, Ann Tendo is the head public relations and public policy, a public policy advisor at Curtail Co. Limited. And like I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this webinar, Curtail Co. is sponsoring this webinar along with Sindel Advocates, which is a prominent law firm within Uganda. So Anne is a passionate lawyer with great leadership and communication skills, as are going to be displayed today. She's a prolific writer with extensive experience as a writer and editor, accumulated from her time at Solutions Africa, Baroque Publishers, Refugee Law Project, and as an editor for the Makerere Law Journal. She is an engaging trainer and a passionate speaker, and she's also a fellow champion of the All African Human Rights All Africa Human Rights International Humanitarian Law Moot Court Competition, where she emerged as winner in 2015 while she was at law school. She also represented Uganda in the 2017 White and Case Philip C. Jessup Moot Court competitions in Washington, D.C. Ms. Anne currently serves as the head public relations as well as policy advisor for Curtail Co. Limited. She's the company secretary for Bambino Life Foundation, a not-for-profit organization based in Kampala, Uganda, that seeks to promote girl child education and empowerment, creates awareness for children with disabilities. She also serves as a member of the advisory committee of Network for Public Interest Lawyers, where she provides consultancy and advisory services to the Secretariat. Please join me welcoming Ms. Anne Tendo, Head PR and Public Policy Advisor at Curtail Co. And could you say hello to our listeners?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Joyce. I'm happy to be here, and I hope I'll learn.
So, Anne, you're very welcome. And before we start, like I've asked everyone else, I want you to tell us about Curtail Co. Who is Curtail Co? What do they do? And what causes do they champion? I know one of which is this webinar. I want to know what's the thought process behind conducting such webinars. Could you please share with us?
Curtail Co is a legal consultancy based in Uganda, though we envision it to be an international legal consultancy. And at the moment, we are championing freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association. That is basically where our campus is based at the moment. We have been able to build partnerships with various actors, and we are currently advocating for some of these rights in Uganda and elsewhere. We have been able to help various people whose rights in this area have been violated or breached either by individuals or by the state to have access to justice. And at the moment, that is where we are basing our energies. And that is why we are having a webinar such as this one. But we've had various webinars as well on different aspects, which may not necessarily be on these freedoms that I've listed, but they touch other rights. All in all, we know that a lot has been going on during this time, and we are choosing not to be silent at such a time as this when we want certain issues to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for giving us a sneak peek into Curtail Co. Now, you've heard from the different speakers, from different panelists from literally across the world. We've heard from, the UK, we've heard from South Africa, we've heard even from our neighbors, Kenya, here from Nigeria and the US. Now, Uganda finds itself in an interesting but unique situation amongst the sizable number of nations in the world, including those that are represented here. From the perspective of the people of faith, like during Amin's time, to the infamous religious policy, I think it was back 6 years ago, to now a unique set of, 3 copies of religious sector guidelines, all intended to regulate the faith community, and in particular, the Christian Pentecostal movement. Is there a story behind the story being fed to the populace? What do you think?
Thank you very much, Joyce. I do believe that there's a story behind the actual story that is being fed to the general population. you have given a background of how we have had religious oppression in Uganda, starting from the time of dictatorship, the Amin regime, where freedom of religion was oppressed in ways that people actually had to worship from underground. And I think the best depiction of that we have at the moment is China. But now bringing it back to where we are right now, the government, under the Ministry of Health and in conjunction with the Interreligious Council, has developed what we call standard operating procedures for places of worship as a precondition for them to be reopened. They are putting in place certain measures which have been, dressed in kind language, like Andrea also said is happening in the UK. They look good on the outside. They look like they are trying to protect people, and because the state has a responsibility to protect people's lives in such a time as this one. But what is actually happening is the fact that they're creating what I would say is like a licensing kind of notion, whereby before places of worship can actually be opened up, they have to undergo licensing. And these standard operating procedures state clearly that if places of worship do not obtain these licenses, then they will not be permitted to reopen after or during this season that we are in, where the lockdown is being phased out slowly. You will find that they have developed specific guidelines, and number one is the fact that different religious leaders have to be trained before places of worship can be reopened, which I find really amusing, because there has been little or no regard at all for people's beliefs in healing, in God's power to heal. And speaking as a Christian, on my end, it's like people are believing in a God who is powerless. I am really disappointed in the fact that we have people who are claiming to be leaders of Christians on the Interreligious Council, and they're coming up with guidelines that are actually stating that people should be taught about the disease in the place of worship. Before anything happens, people should be told to do certain things that are as if, glorifying the disease rather than, upholding the banner of God in the places of worship. So according to me, I believe that there's a story behind the story, because initially we had the religious faith organizations policy and an act that the government was planning to release. There was a lot of politics that was happening behind the enactment of this act by the Ministry of Ethics and Integrity in Uganda, to the extent that in order to appeal to the population, they had to use means such as mudslinging certain renowned figures, religious figures, and faith leaders. And they used mainstream media to sell the story. And then at the end of the day, when there was public outcry from pastors and other religious leaders across the nation for this issue to be addressed, it was the policy and the act was shelved. And so people thought that people thought that it had been put on hold and consultations were going to be done. But then when the pandemic began, it was repackaged in form of the standard operating procedures, and now they want to bring it back in this form, to the extent that we cannot worship unless we do what the government tells us to do, unless we do or adhere to how they want us to worship. So it is my opinion that honestly there's something behind the story that is being told to people in Uganda and world over. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for sharing your opinion on that. If I can get it correctly, you're saying that there seems to be, for lack of a better word, the story behind the story. You're saying right from the start, there's been a direct ploy to regulate the faith community, and that the COVID-19 is just an avenue, an opportunity that has been used to just revisit and bring back the same regulations of the church. I want to know, having heard what is happening in all these other jurisdictions, do we really need guidelines to regulate how we worship? Whether or not a nation is in crisis.
I believe we do not need guidelines, because when you look at things like freedom of conscience of a person, it is very, very difficult to regulate something like that. I might wake up tomorrow and my conscience is telling me that the right thing for me to worship is a tree, but there are people who have been worshiping trees for a very long time, and they may want me to worship the tree in the way they have been doing it, yet my conscience is telling me that I should worship the tree in a different way. So similarly, I feel like religions are something that are difficult to regulate. Fine, on the national and international legal scape, we have laws that provide for the freedom of religion, and there are limitations through which the religion can be regulated. But you'll find that the regulations have to be proportionate, and they should not, and I've been looking at decisions from the European Court on Human Rights, and they're saying that above all, the freedom of individuals to self-determination should be upheld above some of the practices that states want to bring in, such as trying to limit these rights in a disproportionate way, or trying to dictate for people how they ought to exercise their freedom of conscience, their freedom of association, as far as association to religious bodies is concerned. So at the end of the day, you find that the regulations that are being proposed are extremely disproportionate, and they're infringing upon some of these rights in ways that you can never imagine. And so, in my view, it's a very difficult area to be regulated, and maybe we do not need regulations on top of what the constitutions and the international laws that we have in place already state.
So you're basically saying we already have laws that govern how we conduct ourselves. We have our constitutions, each country has theirs. So why the need for these extra regulations for the church, whether we are in crisis or not? Which leads me to the next question, is the Interreligious Council of Uganda, which is a representative of the global syndicate of the interfaith organizations, spearheaded by the Pope, has always played a central role in proposing guidelines to regulate faith, especially the church, which often seem to be adopted by the government. Why and where does it draw its mandate to regulate faith?
Pardon?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, I was saying there's a question that came in that the Interreligious Council of Uganda, which is a representative of the global syndicate on interfaith organizations, which is spearheaded by the Pope, has always played a central role in proposing guidelines to regulate faith, especially the church, which often seem to be adopted by the government. I'm wondering where does it draw its mandate to regulate faith? Because from what we've been discussing already, you're saying we already have a constitution. We already have, whether it's the Bible that regulates us. So where does, this interreligious council draw its mandate to regulate this faith?
What I can say from my research is the fact that the Interreligious Council is just an organization that was registered under the laws of Uganda as, as a not-for-profit organization. However, if you look at the manner in which it has been operating and the manner in which government has been engaging it, it seems to operate as if it is a body that has been instituted by law, yet it is not one. And then secondly, it seems to be operating as if it encompasses all religions and faith-based places of worship, yet it actually does not. And so I can say for certain, we do not know where it derives its mandate from. Maybe some of its operations are illegal in a sense, because they are infringing on people's rights, especially the freedom of association, because different Ugandans have freedom to associate with the Interreligious Council or not to associate with it. Unfortunately, it's in consultation with the government, and whatever it says is what the government chooses to go with, to the extent that it has drafted standard operating procedures. If you look in on it, they seem to say that they're trying to promote unity across religions, but you look at it and see that there's actually no unity within the organization itself, to the extent that they propose standard operating procedures, but different religious leaders under that umbrella have different operating procedures that they have come up with to apply to the different religions that they represent. I don't know if it is a case of everyone wanting to be seen to do something, or a case of wanting to obtain money from the government, because people have a lot of things going on, and they want to have a full-blown training across the country. There's a lot of money at stake, a lot of mobilization being done. People are graduating in COVID-19, understanding COVID-19 and getting certificates so that they can reopen places of worship, which is really ridiculous. So I can say for certain, I do not understand where they get the mandate from to train in COVID-19, because they're not even health practitioners. And some of the things that they're proposing are really discriminatory, such as the proposal to have children and elderly people left out from places of worship in case they get reopened, because children, and there's no rationale that is being given as to why they're being left out. Yet they have a right to practice their religion. They have a right to manifest their religion. Maybe they might argue that elderly people are easily prone to the disease. But then there's no backing that they're giving as to why they're giving all these guidelines as to why children are not being allowed. And then you find that they provide for things such as while giving announcements, you ought to give room for government procedure to be announced in church. You have to give room for people to be enlightened about COVID-19 during a church service, during a service where people have come for healing. You're telling them that this is what you ought to be doing. This is what ought to be done. It's really discriminatory in a way. And maybe just to add on to what the other panelists were saying, you'll find that even in Uganda, different places have been opened, different public spaces have been opened. You find that we have arcades, we have malls, they're all open right now. But then places of worship are not yet open. The proposal is for them to be open to a scale of only 70 worshippers per session. And yet we have gatherings that can even go up to about 10,000 in Uganda per sitting. They are more orderly, so to say, but then we have markets that are really crowded. We have trading centers that are really crowded. And then the stringent measures that are being imposed, such as in order for a place to worship to be open, you have to have an ambulance, you have to have attendants, you have to have medical practitioners in place. Yet some of these are not the measures that have been put in place for the malls and the arcades to be opened. I know for one that there's no mall in Uganda that has been told to have an ambulance in place. There's no mall that has been told that they have to have doctors waiting in place in case anything happens, in case anyone faints or anyone sneezes, which I find to be uneven in a way. So the things that are being proposed by the Interreligious Council are in a way discriminatory, they're irrational, they violate certain human rights, I believe, and honestly, I do not understand where they get their mandate from, or where they get the basis to advise the government on religious issues that cut across different Ugandans in a manner as if everyone ascribes to them.
Thank you so much, Anne. You've really ended on, an interesting point, and I think has brought to light some issues that many of us hadn't considered. The fact that the interreligious organization is actually not a government entity, that it's actually setting up rules and regulations that are governing everyone, and yet it's actually not a government entity, and it's being given all, it's nearly an NGO that is putting out, all these regulations, and everything is being taken wholesale as though, what, this is a government entity and this is what government is proposing, and government is taking it on. I think it's important for our listeners to hear that and know that just because the interfaith organization has put up these guidelines, yes, government is accepting them, they are not representative of everyone. And you're allowed to speak, and now is the time to speak and not be quiet. I thought that was very interesting for our members to know, and also sharing the experience of what is happening in Uganda, the fact that, like I said, there's a common thread that seems to be going around, There are specific guidelines for the churches, but everywhere else, everything is okay, So it's like this COVID is very selective. So that means you can get COVID in church, but you can't get it in a marketplace, which really isn't the case. So that means someone needs to be thinking beyond what we are seeing and see, is there a motive behind all this? And now I would like to invite our next panelist who's just joined us all the way from the USA. And I'm going to request our IT person to put up his profile for the rest of us to see. It's a very impressive profile. Sean Nelson, you are very welcome. He's a legal counsel for Global Religious Freedom Alliance, Defending Freedom International from the USA. Sean serves as the legal counsel where he advocates on behalf of Christians and other religious minorities being persecuted for their faith around the world. In this role, he supports ADF's International Allied Lawyers Network, who represent clients whose freedoms of religion is suppressed. It's based in Washington, and he engages with the US State Department, the US Congress, US States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and various other institutions and organizations to coordinate efforts to promote religious freedom worldwide. Now, prior to joining ADF International, Nelson was an associate attorney at Jenner and Block LLP in LA, California, where he focused on complex commercial litigation and government investigation. He earned his JD at Harvard Law School, where he worked as a research assistant, helping to develop arguments for robust religious freedom protections in pluralistic societies. He also received an MA in English from the University of California, Irvine, and BA in English and Art History from the University of South California. Nelson is admitted to the State Bar of California. Nelson, you are very welcome all the way from the USA. Can you say hello to our listeners, please?
Just 1 second. Okay. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you're able to hear me. I had to call in through the phone, which is more reliable on my end. Good afternoon to all you. Good morning for myself. It's great to be with all of you, and I want to thank Curtail and all that you've been doing in Uganda and in Africa. It's been wonderful working with you the past few months, and for inviting me to speak on this panel. So ADF International, we're the international kind of sister organization to Alliance Defending Freedom, which is an organization that's been around in the US for about 25 years now. ADF International has been around for 10 years, and we're a faith-based legal organization that works to protect fundamental freedoms for everybody, including the fundamental freedom, the right to religious freedom, the right to life, and the right to protections for family and marriage. And so that's really our core mission. And so the topic of today's talk about whether COVID restrictions have been legitimate or whether they have been overbearing and overzealous when it comes to religious communities, and in particular when it comes to Christians, I think it is a really important one, and the one that we've been dealing with all across the board internationally and in the U.S. For the past 6-7 months, really since the crisis began. So I was asked just to briefly talk a little bit about the broader persecution of Christians around the globe, and I think that's an important context for this whole conversation. Is that it's not as if overzealous COVID restrictions just come out of nowhere. Right? There have been many cases, and unfortunately increasing cases, of discrimination and persecution against Christians around the world in a lot of different areas, and those have been really concerning. In Europe, which is one of the places that we really focus on, it's where we're headquartered. We're headquartered in Vienna. We've been working really for the past 10 years to make sure that that the state does not unduly interfere with the rights of religious organizations to live and preach and worship in public, and to speak in public about what their beliefs are and what they think is right or wrong. And that's been something that we are very proud of and continue to do, even as, you know, many secular organizations and international institutions have been pushing back against that kind of robust view of religious freedom. But at places like the United Nations, the European Union, Council of Europe, and European Court of Human Rights, we've been successful in a number of areas in making sure that actually that robust, broad notion of religious freedom, where you do have the right to go into your workplace and live out your faith, or you do have the right as a medical practitioner not to perform certain acts that are against your conscience, things like that. And in other parts of the world, including sub-Saharan Africa, but also the Middle East, throughout Asia, those are sort of the main areas. There are some real worrying instances of very, very serious persecution that we're talking about, not just restrictions on the ability to worship and out in public, but the ability to even share your faith with anybody. In the Middle East, there are a number of countries where it's illegal to proselytize, that you can't simply just talk to somebody and share the gospel with them in a way that they feel is you know, proselytization. That can be illegal in certain places. In many places, just gathering. You think of China in particular is one area. Just having a church, especially in rural areas, can be a very dangerous thing. And if you're not part of the sort of patriotic church organization, patriotic in quotes, a church organization that says, well, China, you know, the government is on par with God rather than beneath God, and that God's superior, then China may bulldoze your church. They may pull down your cross, and they may harass, arrest, and even torture you in some instances. And of course, many people are aware of the other situations facing the Uyghur Muslims in northwest China in the Xinjiang region, which is just an atrocious situation of 1 million Uyghur Muslims, but also including Uyghur Christians and other religious minority and ethnic groups who have been put into these so-called re-education camps, which are more like detention camps or concentration camps up there, and just taken completely out of society. And so that's you know, in some of the instances, some of the really most aggressive persecution that you'll see. In other regions, you'll see non-state actors, not just governments, but terrorist groups, mob violence that attack people specifically for their religious beliefs. And one of the groups that really got everybody's attention a couple of years ago was the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, right, with ISIS. And it took far too long for people to respond to what was happening there, that they were wanting to, you know, establish their caliphate, that they were wanting to just eliminate Christians, Yazidis, anybody who stood in the way of their extreme vision. And unfortunately, we see that same kind of ideology growing, particularly throughout North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa. One of the regions I work a lot on is Nigeria, and with both Boko Haram, IS West Africa, and these sort of armed groups that are associated with the Fulani These are really big concerns where you have Christians being slaughtered by the thousands each year, and that's been going on for many years. And unfortunately, because it's Christians who are being killed, the international community, for some reason, feels as if they can't speak up fully about it. That they don't want to be seen as protecting Christians or promoting a particular Christian viewpoint, that's somehow politically incorrect or wrong or would cause backlash or things like this. But instead, you're just leaving people out there on the killing fields. It's really a very strange and disturbing dynamic. And so that's something that we see a lot. We have seen throughout Africa kind of greater attempts at restricting religious freedom and the freedom to worship publicly, the freedom to act on your beliefs, and especially the independence of religious and faith-based organizations. And I'm sure other panelists were able to speak about that. I unfortunately could only just join right around 8 o'clock this morning. But in Uganda, as has been stated probably by everybody here, right? We are seeing with the religious and faith organization policy an attempt to really kind of clamp down and restrict what religious organizations are able to do to make sure that that pastors go through this particular kind of training session that, of course, is going to be run by the government, that the government is going to license, that they're going to make sure that the pastor doesn't say anything that the government doesn't want to do. Well, we hear that all the time from many different governments that, oh, this is just about protecting the citizens from extremism or fraud or things like that. But there are already laws against all of those things. There are already tools that exist that don't require churches to get some sort of permission just to be a church, right? That don't require a pastor or preacher to get permission from the government just to be a pastor or preacher, just to spread the gospel. So these are things that we're seeing, not just in Uganda, but we've seen in Mozambique, we've seen in Nigeria, we've seen in a number of other countries, and we've seen more broadly across the world. And then one last thing that we see is really a lot of speech restrictions. So you'll see blasphemy, apostasy laws in many places. Apostasy applies especially to converts. Usually it's applied to converts who are coming from a Muslim background, who will often want to become Christian, or they may convert to a different faith or to no faith at all. And in countries that outlaw this can be really a death sentence for many of them. If even just the accusation of being an apostate can really be a thing that tears them apart, tears them from their community. It's not just the state, but even family dynamics where they'll be restricted from just normal actions. Blasphemy laws are in, I think it's now about 73 countries or so around the world have some form of blasphemy law where if you say, again, it's where they're enforced, although it's worrying to have these laws even where they're not enforced, but the areas where they're usually enforced are, again, Muslim majority countries, and it's really used against the religious minority groups, also some other co-Muslim religionists, just to make sure that people don't step out of line, that they don't say things that the government doesn't want them to say, that they don't express their faith fully. In Iran, just saying, Jesus is Lord is enough to be blasphemous in that country. And unfortunately, we've seen some places have removed their blasphemy restrictions, which has been a good thing. Sudan most recently has removed those, and I think there's been a lot of progress on the religious freedom front for Sudan, although there are some worrying things towards the border with South Sudan in terms of some continued violence and tensions there. But in countries like Indonesia, they've tightened up and expanded their blasphemy restrictions and to just a whole host of things that don't even sound like what you might even think of with blasphemy. Just criticizing somebody in authority in a way could be seen as blasphemous. And additionally, I think a lot of us know pretty well about the really awful levels of these laws in Pakistan, where you had Asia Bibi, who spent 10 years in prison, many of those years with a death sentence over her head, for doing nothing more than having taken a drink of water from the wrong well of a neighbor, who used that to retaliate against her and claim that she committed blasphemy. And for that, hearsay was admitted into the court. For that, she was sentenced to death. For that, two of her advocates, including well-known politicians, were assassinated because they wanted to stand up for her right to live and speak as a Christian in Pakistan. And so those laws, well, she eventually was exonerated and acquitted of those charges, thank goodness, and was able to flee to Canada and is advocating for people who have been persecuted. Those laws are still on the books, and even now there was a lawyer who was shot in the courtroom in Pakistan because he wanted to defend the rights of a Christian there. So that's the sort of background for restrictions around the world, and there's been kind of a growing outcry, at least the kind of U.S. located and international religious freedom community, but also from a number of other countries, that the COVID restrictions are being used not just for legitimate health and safety concerns, but that they're being used to specifically target Christians, so they're being used to target religious minorities, and that these restrictions are not going to go away very easily. We're now in the 7th or 8th month, and many places still have that. Uganda is only now just potentially maybe reopening in terms of churches, and there are still many undue restrictions on there. And I was asked to talk a little bit about some of our cases that we've taken with lawyers in terms of pushing back on unjust restrictions on the ability to worship during this particular time. There are, in the U.S., there have been two particular cases that one of them made its way up to the Supreme Court, and then another was denied cert. And I think both of them ended up being denied cert when they got to the Supreme Court. But the first one involved California and was a church that wanted to open and worship and just follow all the health and safety guidelines, all the things that were there. But the state said, no, we're not going to let you do that. And so we took those cases up even to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, those restrictions were not removed there. There were four dissenting opinions, or four dissenters who really thought many of these had gone overboard. But the thought was, well, this is early on. We need to give a lot of deference to the government to at least kind of figure things out. And so, okay, then let's see what happens as things start reopening. There was a case in Nevada where I think this was a very worrying thing that happened there, and then a worrying denial of certiorari at the Supreme Court, where the churches that wanted to open, they were being closed, but the government was allowing casinos to open at the same time, right? So you could go and gamble, and there weren't nearly the same kinds of restrictions on the number of people who could be there, on what you could do. Go to a slot machine. You can't, this was a sort of strange discrimination that just on its face made no sense. and really could hardly be justified in many of the ways that the restrictions in Uganda really couldn't be justified, that discrimination. So unfortunately, that was denied cert, I think, without comment, but there were a number of strong dissents there as well. And I think a lot of people are just recognizing just how that doesn't make sense, that there's something unjust there, and whether it's just that governments enjoy having that power and doling it out to this group or that group. I think one of the things that often goes through officials' heads is well, worship, can't you really just do it online? Can't you just kind of connect that way? I suppose if we didn't have the internet, you could just worship through the mail or over phone or something like that. But can't you just do that? It's not like you're providing an essential service. It's not like you're providing medical services or food. You're only providing the worship of God, who created you. So how essential could that be? I don't know what goes through many officials' minds. I'm sure many of them do have sincere health and safety concerns, but they don't seem to share the concerns about the health of people's souls, which is really why we have churches. And so that's something that.
So, cut you short a bit there.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you for sharing the statistics that you've shared with us. I think. No. It's just we have one more speaker that's coming on. I don't know if his network is clear, but one of the things that has really come out from what you have said is, and I think important for all of us to note, is the fact that once these guidelines, first of all, the COVID-19 is being used really to increase, the whole limitation of what the church can do. And if I get it clearly from what you're saying once these guidelines are out, it's going to be very difficult to retract. So whatever we are agreeing to might not be that easy to retract. Whatever freedoms we're relinquishing, we might not be able to get them back, and which is an important issue for our viewers to take note on. I don't know if Professor Teddy is on from Nigeria. We have a few minutes, but I have like a burning question that I have for him. Professor Teddy, can you hear me? Professor
Yes,
Teddy?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
we really wanted to hear from you.
Okay, it's a wonderful opportunity to be with you. I want to say that you have done well. Can I proceed now? Hello?
Yes,
Hello,
you can.
Okay.
Yes, you can. And ask, can you hear me? I want to ask you one question, and then maybe as you're speaking, you can also address Nigeria.
Okay.
Nigeria has largely been known to be an Islamized state.
Yeah.
It's known as, much as it's, it's been known as an Islamized state, it's also known as a hub for active religious persecution with the coming of Boko Haram and all that. Nevertheless, you are one of the voices that has attracted your government's attention due to your consistently being vocal, both through the mainstream media, in newsprint and social media regarding any attempt to pass any stringent laws against the faith community and especially the church, like the COVID-19 guidelines, the CMA MA Act 2020, amongst others. So even as you're sharing with us your presentation, can you tell us a bit about that and what we, the people of faith, ought to do? I am going to give you about 5 minutes to try and wrap as much as you can around that. And right now, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, it's a pleasure. I want to say that by the grace of God, I am the founder of the International Christian Lawyers Evangelism Network. The network is a network of Christians, across the country and even beyond. For the fact that you are a Christian, you have automatically become a member of the organization, but you must be a lawyer. So it's a standard for using the law as a ministry to preach the word of God. And over time, we have actually got to understand that a lot of people have actually used the law to advance the selfish cause of humanity, leading to all kinds of problems in our society, to the extent that people no longer respect or obey the law the way they should. So we, on our own part, we have actually decided to use this platform to get across to all lawyers who are Christians to use law as a tool of evangelism to preach the word of God. In addition, I'm the prayer secretary of the Christian Fellowship of Nigeria in my branch, Warri branch, where my jurisdiction is. So we've actually been doing so much. We've done so much in terms of cross-fertilizing ideas, in terms of getting the government to do what they are supposed to do for the benefit of not even just Christians, but for all. But, Jesus Christ represents love. So as lawyers, we are using it as a way to raise the public awareness, all around the country for the oppressed to know that Jesus Christ is actually working through us who are lawyers to advance the cause of God's kingdom. So that is the much I can say about it for now. Hello? Hello?
Hello? Can
Yes,
you hear
yes,
me
yes.
now?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. So you've told us a bit about your mandate and all. I wanted to hear from you. I understand you had a presentation for us that you wanted to share with us, especially regarding this whole religious persecution. I don't know if I can give you a few minutes to share it with us. Okay. Do you have it ready on you?
Yes, the presentation is there, is my laptop. I'm just going to summarize it so that you have an idea of what it is all about. It's actually a practitioner research work, being a paper for presentation in this particular program. I love this topic. Look at the topic, the COVID-19 church guidelines, a global attempt to curtail the gospel. This topic, you are using it to tell us something about Nigeria. For me, the topic was crafted for Nigeria because the church in Nigeria is almost under attack by virtue of some laws that have been introduced by the government in order to technically curtail the gospel. So we are using this as a medium to get the entire world to know what is happening in Nigeria. If you look at the law very well, you will see some very, very funny sections in the law. And the law is basically what we call the Companies and Allied Matters Act. In Nigeria, if you want to register a church, you have to register the church through a particular commission, otherwise known as the Corporate Affairs Commission. And there is a law that sets up the commission, and that law is the Companies and Allied Matters Act. I want to tell you that this law has been there since the 90s. In this COVID-19, they came up with a law. I don't know what a law is coming up to do now in order to control the church, to regulate the church. So, the church has been a kind of the voice of the oppressed in Nigeria. Pastors have been speaking. A lot of people have been speaking. We have been speaking. You cannot run down any man of God without us coming out to say something about it. Recently, there was something like that, and I actually came out online, to say something about it. But This law is technically a way of telling you that if you speak too much against the government will come after you. Are you following me? Hello, are you following me? So if the sections 839 subsection 1, section 231, 23 subsection 1, section 839 subsection 7, and section 847 subsection 2 are the sections the government have actually crafted to curtail the gospel by the estimation of Christians in Nigeria, and we have been speaking against it. Now, let me focus on the first session. The first session, as a matter of fact, is telling us that if a pastor is found to have shown any misconduct, that the registrar of CAC, otherwise known as the regulatory body, has the power to remove the pastor, interim body, a committee, to take charge of the church. And the register, which is the representative of the government, also has the power to appoint anybody that he, in the interest, as they claim, public interest, or what they call public interest, to manage the church. Now, when you have a situation where a church, which is a product of revelation, a church, which is a product of faith, is now being controlled by the government with the use of a law, with the use of one piece of regulation moderated by politicians, what more do you want to say about the church in Nigeria? What it invariably means is that the church in Nigeria is almost under attack. And that is the situation that we are facing here. The law came up not long, on the 7th of August, 2020. We are still in the COVID-19 mood. We are still in the COVID-19 fever. Now we have a law that is out to tell you that if you, as a pastor, if you are found to be wanting by virtue of a misconduct of whatsoever form, we are going to remove you. The law also empowers the commission to manage the finance of the church. How can the government manage the finance of the church? The church is not a product. The church is not a product of man-made laws. The church is a product of revelation. The church is a product of faith. So no government, not even the WHO or any of the international organizations has the power to use any law or whatsoever to control the church. They came under the guise of COVID-19 regulations. They started with the COVID-19 rules and what have you. We have a lot of guidelines as actually advocated by the World Health Organization. A lot of Christians in Nigeria, in a bid to obey Romans 13, decided to actually obey the government. In Romans 13, the Bible is clear that you have to obey the government, that it is God that ordains the government. So because of that, the Christians didn't want to see themselves as actually people who are disobeying the law. So when they came up with the COVID-19 guidelines, they obeyed the government. They went indoors, watching what was happening. Till date, COVID-19 is almost still on the increase in Nigeria. I will tell you that COVID-19 is a mystery in Nigeria. COVID-19 is a mystery in the world. COVID-19 is a means to tell the world that we need to know God. COVID-19 is pointing us to the cross. COVID-19 is telling us that you cannot use any law whatsoever to stand against the word of God. That is what COVID-19, God allowed COVID-19 to come. He allowed it. God has the power to stop it through miracles and through men of God. But God allowed it to see if man can use his knowledge to solve the problem. Yet people are dying more and more today. And what we are talking about, they now see that, oh, we need to come up with a new strategy. And this new strategy is the use of a law, otherwise known as the CAMA 2020, the Companies and Allied Matters Act 2020, as a tool to curtail the gospel. And funny enough, it has even made Christians to become more vocal. It has made Christians in Nigeria to become strong. It has rekindled the faith of Christianity in Nigeria. And you can see that all around the social media. At a point, they wanted to use the social media, but it didn't work. Now they want to use a law. It is not going to work. That same law also gives us the power to decide not to even register as an incorporated trustee. So I may decide not to even register my religious organization. The law did not compel us to register our religious organizations. So we have now started telling them that we will even decide not to register our organizations, but we will continue to fight to protect the gospel and to promote the word of God. So that is it. It's disheartening that we have a situation where in Nigeria, some people who believe that they have a kind of faith can do anything against Christianity. And we have said, no, it is not going to work. That is what we are actually out for. I want to tell you this. Do you know that Nigeria is a multi-religious country? In Nigeria, we have all kinds of religious groups, but we have some religious organizations which are more or less like, oh, the talk of the day. And these religious organizations are the Christian faith and Islam. There seems to be a kind of battle, an unknown battle between these two faiths. Funny enough, let me tell you this. The registrar of the commission is a Muslim. The registrar of the commission is a Muslim. How can a Muslim appoint somebody to head a church of Christ? Is it possible for a Muslim to appoint an interim manager to head the Church of Christ? And that is one bad thing about this particular law. We are not actually saying that it is wrong for you to regulate the church to a great extent, but you cannot actually do it, you know, from the whims and caprices of those in power. These are the things we're actually going against, you know. Let me just, you know, have a pause for now and hear what you want to say.
Thank you so much, Professor. I can see you're very, very passionate about this. Unfortunately, we are really running short on time, but I have just one quick question for you before I just have another. Okay. I have like 3 burning questions that are coming in, but I'm going to ask you one of them, and I have another for Andrea and Sean and Wanji. So yours is, some people have always argued that the people of faith should stay away from politics. Would you hold the same opinion, especially with reference to all this, you know, the COVID response and all matters of faith? Should they stay away from politics?
For me, they cannot stay away from politics. For me, they cannot. Yeah, they cannot stay away from politics. They cannot stay away from politics. Getting involved in politics is an issue of faith. I'm a lawyer. You cannot separate law from politics. Is it possible for you to separate the law from politics? It is not possible. So as a lawyer, a Christian, I cannot stay away from politics. Daniel was involved in politics in the Bible. I don't know if you understand what I mean. Daniel was involved in politics in the Bible by appointment. So there are Christians who are going to be there at the ends of affairs, who will be the voice of God, ruling the affairs of men. So they cannot. I am not actually in support of that view that Christians should stay away from politics.
Thank you so much and for that view. And now I'm going to ask Sean. This is a question regarding the Trump administration. ADF International happens to work closely with the Trump administration. and recently was invited to join the policy briefing on the global crisis in religious freedom with Ambassador Samuel Brownback, where this question was addressed. How do nations across stand to benefit from the recent executive order signed by President Trump?
So the recent executive order is the executive order advancing international religious freedom. This is just one of the biggest policies, really, since even the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 was signed and then amended in 2016. The executive order basically says that religious freedom needs to be an important human rights and national security priority for the whole of the United States government. Right? That international religious freedom is not just a small concern, it's not just one thing in one office or two offices in the U.S. State Department, but rather that everybody within the relevant government agencies needs to be aware of what is happening with religious freedom around the world, what are the concerns, and needs to be working directly to put in policies to make sure that people's rights to religious freedom are protected everywhere. And so that's really one of the biggest shifts, is just putting that down on paper and saying, if you work in a relevant agency that's working on foreign policy, you need to know about religious freedom. You need to know where people are persecuted. You need to have a plan in action so that you can improve the lives of those people, because it's a human right, it's a fundamental human right, and it's a big national security concern for the United States. So just that statement alone is a really important thing. There are a number of particular policies that are really, really important as well. So one of these is that every single foreign employee of the United States across the world has to go through religious freedom training. So not just State Department employees, but every employee, so that whenever anybody is working in a foreign country, they will know what's going on in their country with religious freedom. Another big one is to make sure that the U.S. Agency for International Development, so USAID, and the State Department are working on creating a coherent and important plan to make sure that that religious minorities throughout the world are getting the aid directly to them, that it's not just going to some large organization and kind of being diffused or going to places where they're not really getting support. But they need to create an actual plan over the next few years. In fact, they have to create a plan within about 6 months for the next few years on how to reach those people who are being persecuted. I think one of the most important aspects of the executive order is about directing the State Department and the Treasury Department to explore and really consider the use of what they call economic tools. So things like sanctions, visa restrictions, targeted assistance, when you think of security assistance or development assistance, for places where there are massive religious freedom violations going on. You know, why should officials who are committing this violations of fundamental human rights, who are persecuting people, getting U.S. assistance for certain projects that they're doing? Why should they be allowed to travel to the U.S.? Why should they have access to U.S. financial institutions? So those things can be really, really important in terms of getting at the people who are actually doing the abuse and committing the violation. So what the executive order will do, at least this is a hope, and I think there's a lot of us who are really, monitoring and working with the administration on the best way to implement the executive order, make sure that it stays on track and isn't derailed by other interests. But what it does is really, it says, okay, we need the whole of government here, and we need to focus on the victims, right? The people who, making sure that they get the most assistance and that we're advocating for them every single place that we have a presence, and focusing on the abusers and making sure that they're brought to justice, that they aren't allowed to commit crimes against religious people with impunity. So that's the hope of the executive order.
Wow, thank you so much for, I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah, thank you so much for elaborating on that. You know, what we've heard from the different panelists is that different countries are setting up regulations, and in particular for the faith community, and they're saying now for anyone to be able to open up a church, to be able to have their services and all that, they need to be trained in the COVID and, you know, all these regulations that are happening. And in Uganda, pastors are getting certificates on, you know, making sure that they're able to follow these guidelines that are restricting freedom of worship. And what you're saying is President Trump's executive order is saying, you know what, we need to enlighten and train everyone on their right to freedom. And countries that are pushing for, you know, reduction of the right to freedom are likely to suffer sanctions from the US. So I think it's quite important for all of us who are listening to hear that and know that there are some countries that are standing up for the right to freedom. And
yeah, I think it's
can
very
take lead from
important.
that and
I think,
action.
yeah,
Yes,
I
Andrea,
think it's
please.
important that we educate the church leaders. Very often we act in the realms of law and policy making and think that everything's going to be won or lost there. But actually, if you empower church leaders with an understanding of their freedom to worship, their freedom to associate, that God has not granted the civic rulers to be over the church's doctrine, over its practice, and over its polity. And we must stand up. We have the freedom still in many countries to stand up to the government, to the laws that they will seek to impose upon us. There are very good reasons, very good legal reasons to do that. And we must make sure that we educate church leaders to do that so that they understand their rights. What we have seen in the United Kingdom is a capitulation by the church to the civil government. So they diminish their freedoms. They actually go further than they need to. They become subject to health and safety rules, go further than the rest of society, look fearful, close, rather than actually advocating for their religious freedom, advocating for the fact that they are essential services, advocating for the fact that they provide health services and care services and social structures. And so that's something that we is a place that we need to focus on, or we need to, as lawyers, we need to be focusing along the leadership. Also to keep an eye on the fact that whilst, in a sense, the world and nations are distracted, so it looks as if our nation's government is distracted by COVID, but what has happened in the United Kingdom? Well, during this period, quickly, in accelerated legislation, we have introduced no-fault divorce, so that rips up marriage. We have liberalised laws around abortion. So during our lockdown period since March, there have been 102,000 pills by post, abortion pills by post delivered. 102,000 102,000 versus 41,000 deaths by COVID in our nation. So these things have happened. The pill by post is viewed as a human right. It's my right as a woman to be able to access this pill by post in an emergency period. So that's been asked for and has been given in the United Kingdom. And we have accepted that as a good. Similarly, the church says nothing. Similarly, in this period, the church shuts herself down rather than saying, we're going to be open, we're going to be the hope houses and the healing houses for all those women in unplanned pregnancies. So there's some vital education work that needs to be done for the church.
Thank you so much, Andrea. You've kind of, you've preempted the question I was going to ask you. Thank you for sharing with us. And I see a comment here saying, you know, what you're proposing is really, really a good idea. Let's train the religious leaders. Unfortunately, now what is happening in Uganda is they're being trained to adopt an acquiescence to the new normal, rather than empowering them with the knowledge and the freedom of worship. So I would like, unfortunately, we are way out of time. We have just about 1 minute. The questions are so many, but I want to say thank you so much to all our panelists who've been here. You've spent the time and you've really educated us and shown us what is happening out there. And I would like to quickly close today's session by saying thank you to each and every one of you, all the way from Sean from the US, from South Africa, from Kenya, Nigeria, thank you. And to end, for all of us who are listening, with this poem that I usually share. First, they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists. Speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So for all of us listening, you've heard what is happening all across the world. What we've learned and what we are coming up with, what we're seeing from the different jurisdictions is indeed, there is a story behind this whole story. And let's not just sit back and keep quiet. Let's speak up and be counted. COVID, yes, it might be a dangerous disease, but we have a God who is more powerful than this disease. Let's stand out, speak out, understand our freedom of worship and exercise it. Thank you to everyone listening. God bless you, and I hope you've taken home something. Have a nice evening.